And we're on. Mr. Tony Sunderland, thank you for being my second guest.
Oh, it's my pleasure, James.
I really appreciate it. So we've been to and froing a bit for a few months now, and I've recently read your second book, which I absolutely love. And I think we have similar. We're coming at it from different angles, but I really like the way you're unpackaging Gnosticism for the layman, and you're covering very complex, thousands of years of religious beliefs into, quite succinct books and chapters that, sometimes will be 5 or 7 pages that gets to the crux of what it's about without, a lot of books that you're an academic, but you've also got a personal history in all this, I take it. And I really appreciate just that anyone can understand this, and we don't have to spend months or years. It feels like you're doing the work for us, and that's awesome. And I think the best starting point for me on all this would be in your first book, The Obelisk and the Cross, and that subtitle of that is An Alternative History of God, Myth, and Meaning in the Western World. And what I love with that is you begin with a very intriguing fact, and that is that there's an ancient Egyptian obelisk on the grounds of the Vatican. And to me, that's people could argue, well, that's, they've got historical paintings and they've got historical artifacts, and it could be in a financial investment that they own that or whatever. But I believe more likely, and I think that's what you're implying in this, is that implies potential, that's a contradiction. An ancient Egyptian obelisk on the grounds of the Vatican. What's that about? What does that, does that signify the true origins of Catholicism or Christianity? Can you enlighten us on that?
Well, in 2013, my wife and I wandered in to St. Peter's Square, and I came across this 3,500-year-old Egyptian obelisk standing in the middle, and the piazza itself doesn't frame St. Peter's, it frames the obelisk. And I just stood dumbfounded as to why this pagan monument stood in the middle of the most Catholic holy city on earth. And it really sparked in me a desire to find out what was really going on. And I found that the obelisk itself was originally brought to Rome by Caligula and ended up in the circus of Nero, and it was a witness to Peter's martyrdom, and that's the only reason why it survived for all those thousands of years, or 1,500 years in Rome. Eventually, Pope Sixtus V erected it, as I said before, in the middle of the St. Peter's Square, and put a cross on top of it, signifying the church above all pagan religions.
Okay, and yet they still kept the obelisk there. I mean, to me, that's like walking into a synagogue in Jerusalem and there's statues of Buddha. Do you know what I mean? It's just even if they put the Star of David above that Buddha and said this is above that, it's still bizarre. And so when did you say again? What period was that originally put in St. Peter's Square?
It was moved 300 meters, or about 300 meters from the Circus of Nero, the old Circus of Nero, to St. Peter's Square in the mid-1500s, I think.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that's a good starting, the title of your book, The Obelisk and the Cross, for me, that's a great starting point because, this is a very complex subject, this whole history, and it's a real minefield, and people have studied it all their lives and they can't, there's no clear answers as of yet what we're dealing with the origins of Christianity and all. No one really knows for sure, I believe, but I think that's a great starting point because for me, the obelisk kind of represents everything that was either buried in early Christianity or just plain forgotten, and the cross signifies everything Catholicism, Christianity became.
I think that's smack on, James, and that in doing both the books, I took the orthodox in its broadest term as meaning the growth of Christianity over the past 2,000 years, and the obelisk representing all those other Western traditions that have either been suppressed or forgotten about. And they really have intertwined in some degrees at various stages in history to bring about great changes. And just getting back to the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, the person who designed the square itself designed it in the form of an eclipse, or an ellipse, I should say. Okay. And that shows the sun as the centre of our solar system and even the universe back in those days, as opposed to the church or the cross being the centre. So when Bernini did that, he was virtually saying, yeah, okay, I work for the Orthodox, the church, and I'm designing the piazza for them.
Right.
Whole other older faith tradition that dates back thousands of years, and that's important too in our history.
Yeah, I mean, that's very pagan and very Egyptian,
Yes.
coming from all that. Now, and I think this is what I want us to eventually, from reading your books and thinking about this in other ways, I think what I want us to eventually get to here is to discuss the esoteric faiths of the Middle East, which have kind of been buried or suppressed by a bigger religion. And I want us to get across that, at least I want us to at least cover that we've got, it's a lot more complex, early Christianity, than the average Christian would realize.
Yes.
And I think we're both on the same page in that we've explored mainstream religions, but we're essentially truth seekers. But often that's not very popular because but it should, whatever God is, if you believe in God, it would want us to just find the truth, I believe. But this is very sensitive territory and it can trigger a lot of people. But I think one of the best ways, I think, if we go back before all this, like I sense from reading your two books, this is basically your life's work. It's beyond your career. It's beyond research. Now, somewhere you mentioned, I don't know whether it was online or in one of your books, but you mentioned a thing that made me laugh. You said you went to a Catholic school or seminary school or something, and you came home one day and you said to your father, "He's not your real father. Your real father was in heaven." Was that when you were 8 years old?
Yeah, actually, I was 7 or 8 years of age, and I went to a Catholic primary school.
Right.
And part of the, dare I say, indoctrination is that our Heavenly Father is our real Father, and He rules above everything else. So young Tony goes home and tells his dad that, and the next week I was out of the Catholic system and into the state school.
So they thought you were becoming you were heading towards becoming a priest or something.
I think my father certainly did. I think my mother was sort of supportive of it in some ways, but
right.
Yeah, it started off a degree of internal conflict on religious belief, because I did eventually become a confirmed Catholic, and I even taught for a while in the Catholic system. But at the same time, there were so many items of dogma and doctrine that I didn't agree with. It did send me on, dare I say, a life search that has culminated in these two books.
Right. Yeah, I sense that. And I think, that little story there of a child saying, my real father's in heaven, I think that's a nice little angle, because, it strikes me there's so many contradictions in this whole story. And I think when you get into the history of how the organized religion formed, and you see that they were taking from here, taking from there, and I think that explains all the contradictions within the Bible that we've got now, dare I say.
Yeah. See, 2,000 years ago, the Western world, in particular that concentrating around the Mediterranean, was in turmoil. The Jewish people themselves were undergoing a type of reformation, you could say. They had various sects that had particular interests, and into this region Jesus was born, you know, a poor Galilean, surrounded by Roman invaders, surrounded by a faith that was divided. We had different Jewish sects, whether they be the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and even the deadly Sicarii. It was a period of turmoil. And layered on top of that was Greek culture, which had infiltrated 200 or 300 years before. So we had all the rational ideas of the Greeks coming in, and the great Jewish diaspora that was spreading out after being conquered, reconquered, and reconquered. And Christianity was really part of this massive period of upheaval and turmoil.
Yeah. I think, you know, in your book, your second book, which I've just finished reading, loved it, A Crisis of Faith, and the subtitle there is The Battle of Beliefs Between the Christian Church and Gnosticism. Now, when you know, I'm thinking of people who don't know what Gnosticism is, don't know what Gnosis is, and it's there's no strict definition for all this, but you mentioned somewhere that the Gnosis is essentially the belief that we have the promise of the divine within us.
Oh, yeah, that's a great sentence, James, because I think it goes to the heart of the difference between the orthodox and the other. If we go back right to ancient Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and even Rome, the only beings that lived forever were the gods. Now, some men were made gods, demigods, and some gods became men, but humanity as itself was really an inferior being. We were mortal. The best that we could hope for in all those great old civilizations was some type of blurry underworld. Then came Greek rationalism, whether it be Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras. They gave to humanity the promise that we were something better than what we thought we were. And it was this Greek ideal of a rational, dare I say, soul that had its own promise of immortality. And it was these ideas that came and layered themselves on, whether it be the Jewish people or the new Christians that were coming there, and even the pagans. It was a radical idea that man himself, or humanity, had within them a spark of the divine. And that, I think, is really where Gnostic beliefs come from. The element of man.
Right. And then, okay, so so that idea that we have the promise of the divine within us, that's Gnosis, and that it can be illuminated via our own, it's almost introspection or meditation, I take it. Whereas the church frowns upon that, and they're saying it's more through their system. Like, you don't, for example, you don't get a priest or a Christian minister saying, okay, stay home for a week or don't come to church for the next month, because the kingdom of heaven is within, which is what it says in the Bible. And there's an example of the contradiction. The kingdom of heaven is within, but no, you've got to come to our system and follow our path and listen to what we tell you, even though the kingdom of heaven is within. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's the whole clash between the organized religion that it became and the Gnostic path, or the esoteric Middle Eastern path. Is that about right? Or?
Oh, I think it's totally correct, James. With Christianity, it developed around the concept that the individual falls short of saving himself or herself. We can't do it on our own. We're scarred by the sin of Adam and Eve. Therefore, we need the church to act as an intermediary between God and us, to give us an ark of salvation. They, in their promise to us, the church's promise to us, is that through faith in the church and faith in Jesus Christ and God, you will be saved. But it has to be through the intermediary of the organised, apostolic endorsed church. Opposed to that, as you said before, is the Gnostic belief of individual self-illumination.
Right, and that's almost, you know, when I hear that, it sounds like more like the Eastern faith, where you would go within with a meditation or whatever. And I think what's fascinating to me is that, you know, people say, well, Christianity is 2,000 years old, but I would argue Christianity as we know it is really, what is it, just under 1,700 years old, in that you've got the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD,
Yep.
And you'd know more about this than me, but my understanding is they basically at that point decided what would be in the New Testament, and they decided what would be removed, what would stay, what would fit the vision. And so that's over 3 centuries after Christ. You've got these people who are Roman, you know, including Roman emperors, Roman politicians, involved in this supposedly a book written by God, you know, but they're deciding there what stays, what goes, what do we change. And then after that, but before that event, you've got a whole lot of competing beliefs. You've got all these different Gnostic sects. You've got, you know, even the continuation of the Jewish faith. But that was the stamp. 325 AD was the point where you had what we would recognize as Christianity. Is that about right?
Yeah, the Council of Nicaea endorsed Jesus Christ as both purely divine and purely human.
Right.
And if we go back a bit further, the Jewish people saw any incarnation of Jesus as purely human, not divine. Even early Jewish Christians really saw Jesus as a man more than any type of God. The Messiah foretold in the Old Testament is a man, he's not a God. Given the Gnostic view, which gradually came out in the first 2 centuries CE, they saw any incarnation of Jesus as purely spiritual. And the idea of a human Jesus was just an illusion. So the compromise that came out of Nicaea, let's make him purely human and purely God at the same time. And it's from that premise that Christianity moved on under the guidance of the church.
Right. Well, I think this is very important, because I'll give an analogy here. If you look, let's have a look at the Aboriginal faith. So we're here in Australia here. They believe Aboriginals about 50,000 years old, something like that. And there's even new theories that the out of Africa model is wrong, and the out of Australia model is the one certain scholars are starting to lean towards, and that humans might have come out of this area. Yes. Now they have a faith that they believe in their equivalent of God and all that, and that everything's, you know, the divine is part of all of their life. Now, but that's a faith. That's just a faith, right? And all native peoples have something like this. If you go to the Amazon, this is all way before. And I believe so. These are religions, but they're not. Most of the time when you talk about religion, you think of the big religions. But I would argue the organized religions are a tiny percentage of overall religion. And I guess Christianity would refer to these as pagan religions. Now, the difference here is that those are you just have a belief in some sort of God, and that's it. But the difference with Christianity is it's a belief in God, but it's also a belief in strict historical things that definitely occur. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of Christians, when you bring up this stuff, I find they don't really want to get into that, because they've got their faith, but but really it has to work both ways. It has to have happened as it's described, and you have to have the faith in God. But it can't. But a lot, I think, are just approaching it like a faith system. But I'm more interested in like if the history is in question, then everything is in question, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I think definitely it is. The diminishing of the human Jewish Jesus over time in preference for the divine Christ has really skewered the faith in a particular direction that in some ways is, I think, has held it back, especially in the 20th century.
Mm.
I think it gets back to a lot of Christians even today have an incorrect concept of their own faith and its view of what heaven is. Most Christians believe that when you die, if you've held true to your faith and lived an appropriately pure and holy life, you will go to heaven. That's not the case. According to Christian scripture, the New Testament scripture, when you die, you will rest in your grave and you will be judged once by God, and if deemed to suffer some time in purgatory, your soul will suffer in purgatory, and at the time of the final judgment, your physical body will be resurrected. And I don't mean your spirit, I mean your actual physical body will be resurrected, rejoined with your soul, and you will be judged by God. Now, Christians really don't think that. Most of them think that you die and your spirit or your soul will go to heaven. No, Christians believed in physical resurrection of the dead. And that is totally against the Gnostics, who believe that the body is just a prison, that a person's spirit or spark of the divine is trapped within the body and material existence. And
actually, you brought up an interesting idea there, that a lot of Christians are not really reading the Bible in depth, but they resonate with the spirit of the whole faith, I think. And maybe a lot of them are Gnostics without realizing it. If you really and I mean, it's such a massive book, and it's so contradictory in places, and it's so the language is hard to. It's like reading Shakespeare. But if you really broke it down in the cleanest terms, and you didn't describe this is Christianity, this is Gnosticism, maybe a lot would actually be closer to Gnosticism. What do you think?
Totally agree. If a medieval pope was brought through time today, he'd kill 3/4 of the Christian population.
Right.
He would go to them and go, "What happens when you die?" "Oh, my spirit goes to heaven." "No, sorry, you're dead. You burn."
Oh man. I mean, yeah. I mean, going forward with this whole, it's almost Gnosticism versus Christianity, I think, is what we're getting to. And this is all, I mean, you bring up you've got a chapter in there about how from the 1960s onwards, a lot of the Gnostic ideas were reinvigorated. And I think that's off the back of, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nicaea, and we can get to that in a minute. But one analogy I was thinking of here is that, throughout history, the major annoyance to Christianity or the church, in my opinion, were the Jews. Because here you have, like, you're saying, okay, the church has the truth, and yet Jesus was a Jew, and the Jews came first, and the Old Testament, which is 50% of the Bible, which is basically the Torah, and that's a Jewish, that came thousands of years before, and yet the Jews are sitting there and they don't believe in Jesus. And I believe that's, I've studied the history of anti-Semitism and what led to the Holocaust, and that there are all sorts of mini Holocausts throughout history, and a lot of them were coming from the church, and even Hitler thanked the Catholic Church for the thing. Now, I'm not saying that's reflective of Christians' beliefs throughout, but I think the Jews were a major, major annoyance, and if they could have wiped them away, they could have. But I believe now, the analogy I'm thinking of here is that now, in more recent times, the Gnostics are a huge annoyance. I mean, since the Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it strikes me these contradictions are coming more and more to the fore through the internet age. What do you think on that?
I think definitely the triumph of Christianity in some ways was the triumph of St. Paul and his doctrine at the expense of the Jewish Jesus. See, most Christians today don't know that Jesus' mother Mary was married at least twice, that she bore at least 6 children. Jesus had 3, maybe even 4 brothers and 2 sisters. And all these human things indicate Jesus the Jew rather than Jesus the Son of God. There is only one book attributed to Jesus' brother James in the New Testament, and they've conveniently put it right at the back there, nearly next to Revelation. You're right, it's as if the traditions that started Christianity have been suppressed themselves to the extent that most people don't even know about them anymore. And it is very sad because what's happened over the past century in particular, I believe that all forms of faith, Christian, whatever, should be held accountable to the decimation of life that occurred in the 20th century. I mean, James, 50 million people were killed in the Second World War.
Right. And
the existential crisis that comes from that is, I mean, was religion done for us? Was Christianity done for us? Well, if this is our main faith, who's been held accountable?
Yeah, right. No one's going to the Vatican and saying. But can you talk about? I mean, I love that chapter you got on the 1960s because I believe that was a very important era in resurgence of this type of thing. But going back before that, can you, for the person who doesn't know about the Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries, can you talk about what your research on those and why you believe they are important?
Oh, okay. Both sets of books were discovered in between 1945 and 1947. The Nag Hammadi texts were Coptic scriptures, or written in Greek, and they detail an alternative form of Christianity, as we talked about before, that details the existence of Jesus as being a spiritual creature and detailing a path to illumination through secret knowledge or gnosis. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran, and they detail a Jewish community. A lot of scholars label them as Essenes. Whether they're Essenes or not is sort of beside the point at the moment.
Right.
The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of every single book in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament except the book of Ezra. And it details a community that are dedicated totally to practicing their faith in prayer and ritual and how they live every part of their lives. But it's funny, both the discovery of those texts at the end of the Second World War, I don't know whether it was synchronicity or what, it did spark a spiritual revolution that resonated in particular in the 1960s.
Yeah. And that's more, I mean, my understanding of those texts is they're not saying, here you have actual documents that are people who know Jesus or know of Jesus, but we wouldn't recognize the Jesus from the New Testament exactly. Is that correct?
Yes. The Gospel of Thomas, which is in the Nag Hammadi Cache and in other places as well, gives us a Jesus that is totally spiritual. He says that virtually illumination and knowledge is found within yourself. Truth is within you. And given that, you don't need a church. You don't need to go to a congregation. You don't need to sit in a church and pray with the priest to an abstract God. No, the divine is within you. And that did resonate with a lot of the alternative lifestyle.
Like the counterculture of that era, and even now to a degree. So, but that wouldn't sit well if you're a Roman emperor. And my opinion, I know scholars are divided, but my opinion on Constantine is that he didn't really take on the Christian faith, and it was more a political decision. But the thing is, what you just described there about, it will unfold if you go within yourself, and so along the lines of the kingdom of heaven is within. How, someone like, when they sat down with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Romans, that, how do they use that politically? They can't use that. If you just say, well, you will be illuminated, they need people to be. It's as much a political movement as religious, would you say?
Yeah, the Romans tried all they could to ban Christianity for the first 2 centuries after the death of Jesus, and they failed at every point. The more they killed and made martyrs of the Christians, the more popular the religion became. In defense of early Christianity, it really was a religion of the poor. I mean, slaves embraced it. Those people who were illiterate embraced it. And Constantine saw this, and I think he really wanted to make Christianity the endorsed religion of the empire as sort of a galvanizing force, because the empire was on its way out.
Okay.
So I really think his political motives were spurred on by giving everyone, hopefully, a religion that they could all identify with. The price paid for that was the suppression of the Gnostic and more abstract pagan religions, which, as we talked about before, really emphasised the growth of the self. Ironically, most of the Gnostic and Greek-influenced religions were practiced by the elite in society back then, because they were educated enough to internalize this search for meaning as a personal search, whereas the early Christians, as I said, were poor and slaves and illiterate. And
right.
They gave them an easy religion to remember. I mean, even the Catholic Church today, if you go inside a church, well, that they will say the same words each week, in and out, same Lord's Prayer, the same creed is spoken, and that's what came out of Nicaea, was that Nicene Creed, and it just sort of, it framed religion, in particular, well, Christianity, into this box where it was ruled by the church. And as I said, the price paid for that are the more personal pathways to God or illumination.
Right. So, I mean, I guess the key question with all this, and this is where we potentially move beyond, a lot of what you brought up so far is factual stuff, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad that you stuck to that in your books today. But you are someone who has studied this most of your life, and in various ways, even if at the beginning it was a personal level and then it became more your career. So the key question for me, and I'm sure many who listen to this would think the same, is in those 300 years between Christ dying and then the Romans eventually taking on that religion, possibly forced to take it on, reluctantly taking it on and repackaging it to their own convenient brand.
Yeah.
What was, and this could be the question of the Western civilization, for all I know, but what was early Christianity?
Well, my view of early Christianity, as I said, sprang from a time of rapid turmoil. But if I could just take a leap forward from that, if we take the basis of religious belief in total, how do you envisage we spend our time after we're dead? An atheist would say there's nothing.
Right.
An early Christian, at the time of the teachings of St. Peter and St. James, would say well, when you die, you will sleep, and when the Lord returns to earth for the final judgment, you will rise from the dead and enjoy the kingdom of heaven on earth. And I think that was the basis of early Christianity. It took on the Pharisaic belief in the physical resurrection of the dead. And they were a secondary Jewish sect. The primary Jewish sect, the Sadducees, comprised of the high priests, and they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. In no part of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is there any hope of an afterlife except for some blurry underworld of Hades. There is no heaven. There's no mention of heaven in the Old Testament at all. So early Christianity, I think the critical fact was it took a particular aspect of Jewish faith. It had total belief in the Messiah being Jesus Christ, and that he would return to earth for the final judgment. And that final judgment would happen in their lifetime. The final words of Jesus in the New Testament, and it's really sad, he says, "I'm coming soon."
Right.
He never came. 2,000 years later, he hasn't come back. So, answering your question, they believed in resurrection of the dead, and it would happen soon.
But the New Testament we have now still has that stuff in it. Because as you said earlier on, you're dealing with Christians who don't really read the Bible, and they thought that it's about, you die, you go to heaven. But then if you read the Bible with the Bible that we have now, it's not saying that, as you discussed earlier.
No. Heaven is a new Jerusalem on earth, at the center of all things. Heaven is heaven on earth. Earth will be heaven, a perfect resurrected being in a perfect earth. Okay,
because so that we know, at least at the very least, that's there in 325 AD, because that's the Bible. We've got that still in the Bible now. But then I believe this is correct, that the earliest New Testament ever found that we've got now is the Sinai Bible, and that's written on donkey skin, and that book does not mention. And so this is pre 325 AD. I think they estimate somewhere around 300 AD. So before the Romans put their stamp on what all Christian belief is about, or what Jesus was saying. And that Bible doesn't mention the resurrection. So what I'm thinking, and I'm just a layman here, I've had an interest in this for many years, but I haven't been to these areas. I'm not a scholar or anything like that. But it strikes me as pre that period, maybe early Christianity was a religion where you go, or not even religion, a philosophy where you go internal with, like, the Gnostic idea, and everything will be revealed to you. But were they definitely saying in those early centuries before the Council of Nicaea that it's all about Judgment Day? Like, does it show that in the Hammadi discoveries, for example?
No. I can see what you're getting at there. Even the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, there are two endings to it. One gives witness to the resurrection, and the other doesn't.
Right.
I think earlier, this is what came out of Nicaea. They got rid of those earlier versions. They got rid of the Gnostic versions of Christianity. I can see what you're getting at. Yes, there were. They were the other versions. The Gnostic Christians believed in self-illumination. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, but they were influenced by more Greek philosophy. If we do go back to the very, very early Christians,
first century or
second, Peter, they did. I really think they did. They thought, yep, he's coming back. Who's dead? We're going to be raised from the dead, and we're going to live. I mean, we're talking about illiterate Aramaic people, and that they wanted a religion that was certain for them. And there's nothing more certain than, what, I'm going to live forever as me. Whereas the Gnostics, they had a more sophisticated intellectual vision of heaven. And they believed through the internal release of the spirit, you can join in the great divine spirit. But James, you know, there's a paradox between the two belief systems that's really sad.
Okay, what's that?
Well, a person now who is a Gnostic, if I'm taking on the real Gnostic belief, I go through a lifetime of personal searching for illumination. But the price I pay for that when I die is the release of this divine spark into something greater. What happens to me? What happens to the person that actually lived this life? The loves, the turmoil and all that, it's gone. Whereas the Christians in their life, and even today, they surrender to the church. They give up everything, but when they die, guess what? They get to be themselves again forever. So which one would you prefer?
Well, I'm not totally, I think, well, once again, we're getting into broad definitions of what Gnosticism is.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the, I've got a gut feeling that the answer comes in the Persian faiths, the Persian Gnostics.
Yeah.
And what I've read, so I think we've discussed privately the I'm not sure you pronounce it, the Mandaeans.
Yeah.
They seem to be talking about something fairly similar to Christianity. I think in terms of fairly similar to Christianity, in terms of there's something like a soul, and that you carry on as you are yourself, but you're a greater self. And I think possibly we get attached to an identity in this.
Hello?
Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah, I hope we're. I don't know what happened there. I hope we're still.
Yeah, we're still on. It just went bung for a minute.
Right. I hope that's still okay. I can edit that in between. Yeah. I think we've got such a broad definition of Gnosticism that it's hard to. There seems to be a lot of variety in beliefs there. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
yeah.
I agree. I mean, the Mandaeans and even the Manichaeans elevate John the Baptist to be a co-messiah of Jesus. That John the Baptist is the priestly Messiah, and Jesus is the kingly Messiah, as they're told in Qumran, the Qumran text of the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So, yeah, if you look at spirituality, it is very interesting. So you're giving like a third pathway of illumination of the soul that contains elements of the self at a higher level.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's hard. I mean, and also we've all, even if we're not Christian in the Western world, we've all internalized these type of beliefs, and it's hard to shake. It's hard to know. It's, you know, even if you mention the word heaven or God, well, all these Christian ideas come up to us in the Western world, so it's hard to separate that and know even what our own beliefs are. Do you know what I mean?
Well, again, if we go back to the medieval Pope, he's going to put 3/4 of us to death.
Wow, scary.
I think the Greek Revolution and the idea of the elevation of humanity was really the thing that kicked off Gnosticism and layered over the teachings of the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. One thing we haven't touched on so far is that the early Gnostic believers believed that the God of the Old Testament was an evil demiurge, and that he was a flawed creation, and the creation of earth and even humanity flawed and possibly evil. Right.
And I mean, you know, they talk, I've heard people making parallels between the movie The Matrix, which is saying everything's an illusion, and that even ideas like God and that is we could be being tricked. They've made parallels between two religious beliefs on the earth, which is the Hindus who talk about in their ancient texts, the Bhagavad Gita and so on. They talk about everything is Maya, and I've heard people make so Maya is illusion, okay, and then they say the same about they're making parallels beyond that, saying that the Gnostics were talking about something similar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Gnostics believe that above all things is the monad, or the divine invisible spirit. He or she gives birth to Sophia, wisdom, and below Sophia is the Demiurge, the god of the Old Testament. And the God of the Old Testament creates earth and humanity. But Sophia manages to put a spark of the divine spirit in humanity by tricking the Demiurge, or out of the earth. And that spark of spirit, the pure good that rests within humanity, is trapped by the Demiurge, the evil god. And it was the mission of Jesus Christ to provide humanity secret gnosis of the illusion of this world, the evilness and the illusion of materiality, and the promise of illumination of our own divine spark into the greater divine spirit.
So he's promising the illumination and then also eternal life.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay. Wow. Yeah, no, it's even more layered and complex than I thought. So just trying to unpack all this. Let's look at who can fit under, in a broad definition of Gnosticism, and this relates to whether the Gnostics were carrying earlier secret knowledge right through. If, in a broad definition, could you say that people's like, obviously the groups that were called heretical peoples by the Catholic Church early on, obviously those would be Gnostics, but then could you call, say, ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Jews, Freemasons? Could you call all these people under a broad definition Gnostics?
Yes, definitely. Judaism has an aspect of Gnosticism about it, in particular with Kabbalah and spirituality, and the hidden meanings that can be found in the Torah. I think pagan Gnostics, the mystery cults of Dionysus and Mithras, could be linked back to the ancient Egyptians. The Hermetic Gnostics claim knowledge from Hermes, which is both an Egyptian messenger god and a Greek god. So, yes, if we take in particular Hermetic Gnosticism, there does appear to be a line between ancient Egypt right up through to the Renaissance and the resurgence of secret societies. And that's where the Rosicrucians and Freemasonry were re-established or gained a stronger foothold. That's up to debate. And they stood in opposition to, at that time, a very violent church that was going through Inquisition and consolidation. So we've gone off on another journey.
Okay. Yeah, because it's all. I mean, what you were saying there made me think of the foundations of the United States of America, and almost how that's reflective of this schism in these belief structures. Because officially, that's a Christian nation, but then you've got all these founding fathers who are Freemasons. You've got all this Masonic symbolism and so on. And I'm aware that that's all been run away with by conspiracy extremists who are saying, you know, everything means, the eye means this, blah, blah, blah. But if you just take it at its simplest appearance, it seems like there was a main belief structure of the founding fathers of the US, which would be they were probably all in the church or associated with the church, and America was certainly a Christian nation and still is. But underneath that, there seems to be and they seem to have a degree of gnosis, secret knowledge. What would you say to that?
Oh, yeah. Well, by church, I would argue they were members of the Protestant churches, if
Right.
members of churches at all.
Yeah.
And that the Gnostic beliefs that research that gained footholds in that period of time were essentially a reaction against the dogmatic monopolization of faith from the Church of Rome. That's what they were rebelling against. I mean, you and I would not be able to talk the way that we're talking today. These societies had to be secret because they were heretical and it could get you killed.
Right.
And I think the spirit of Freemasonry, in particular in regards to the early American Republic, was just a reaction against Catholicism. And I have an idea that the G, in Freemasonry there's a big G, and they talk about the grand geometrician or design. I think it stands for Gnostic.
Okay. Wow.
And,
so is it possible, from what you've read of these, if we take, let's say they were Essenes for the sake of discussion, and they were writing these scrolls, and there seems to be a more complex belief system there. Is it possible, like supposedly these are all pretty, illiterate peoples, or, is it possible that somewhere in there was a following through from ancient Egypt or something more ancient? Was there greater knowledge of humanity and the origins and the true nature of the universe? Is it possible that that was carried through, and that whatever the Rome was and the resulting Vatican, is it possible that they didn't want that known to the masses? Is it are we dealing with a power thing here, where they want that greater knowledge of who we are suppressed from the mainstream humanity?
I know what you're getting at, but sometime in our past there was a greater knowledge that's been lost and or suppressed, and that in some ways, whether it be the Therapeutae, the Essenes, the Gnostics, the Cathars, the Bogomils, that some line of this secret knowledge has progressed through humanity. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't see it. I've looked for it. I don't see it. The Essenes in particular, I think, were Zadokite priests that were expelled from the great temple in Jerusalem due to the Hasmonean priests taking over the temple and the subsequent Hellenization of Jerusalem. They were a community, in my opinion, that were rebelling against the Hellenization of Israel. And all sons of light who would have an apocalyptic battle against the sons of darkness, who were those other Jews and pagans who did not believe in what they believed in. The Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty dense. And I agree with, I think it's Professor Ilior of one of the universities in Israel, that the Essenes may not have even existed as a sect, that Josephus embellished some of the material that he wrote about the Essenes to elevate the Jewish people as being more Hellenized than what they were.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I think sometimes everything can stack up to look like one thing, like things are being purposely buried or so on. But sometimes when you get deeper into certain things, it can just be certain truths were lost, or it looks like a certain direction, that...
Yeah, James, I'm searching with all my heart for the Holy Grail. I just can't find it.
Yeah, and I mean, myths build up, don't they? I'm on the fence, and I also think it could be a combination of all of the above, where some things were just, whether the Library of Alexandria, for example, was purposely burned down, as many historians say, or whether it was just lost over time? We don't really know exactly, do we?
Well, we don't know. I mean, when I was doing research on the Essenes, and I think there's information from Philo, Josephus, and Pliny, all the historical records add up to about 5 pages. That's it.
Wow. You're joking. Okay.
No, I'm not. That's it. So, and we talk about things. I mean, I was researching, there was a miracle in the New Testament where Jesus spits on mud and gives it to a blind man, and the blind man puts the mud on his eye, and it's for blindness. And I'm reading a theory at the moment, and this is from an esteemed historian, that links the New Testament back to the creation myths of Mesopotamia and even Greece, where man is created out of mud.
Okay, right.
So
they've made a leap. There's a lot of leaps of faith, aren't there? Between
the particular lines of thought are just held so tight, and that's, if anything, I've got more sympathetic to the Gnostic ideas and even Freemasonry, in that it was brave enough to stand apart.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Even if they had to go secret, they're still standing apart.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't agree with the secrecy.
No.
And I don't know why we've got Obelisk in every major city in what major Western city in the world, and even the main monument to the Commonwealth soldiers, that's the Anzacs and the Brits in World War I at Gallipoli, is an obelisk.
That's true. It is too. Yeah, I've just realised that.
Why?
And
any attempts that I've made to find further information on the use of the obelisk, the form of the obelisk, as our main commemorative monument, people just look at me and go, they don't know. So maybe the conspiracy is in plain sight.
I don't know. I mean, I think it all goes back to when we're left with these dead ends, and this gnosis could come from anywhere, and some of it could be incorrect. I mean, as you said, the Dead Sea Scrolls are dense, and some of it is a lot heavier than what Catholicism is saying. It's pretty strict and pretty apocalyptic, and there's one of them that's very militant and so on. So we just don't know. But I think my gut feeling is it goes back to whatever ancient Egypt was, whoever built those pyramids. I mean, I haven't been to ancient Egypt, but I've been to the pyramids, Teotihuacan in Mexico. And it's the exact same thing. As originally they thought, just like in Egypt, they thought many still think, but the pharaohs built the pyramid. And the same with, they thought it was the Aztecs built. Originally they thought the Aztecs built the Mexican pyramids, but then it turns out, no, they inherited them, and no one knows who built those Mexican pyramids. And I think more and more evidence is stacking up that it wasn't the pharaohs, that they inherited that. So then you get, well, did someone just put all that symbolism, all that mathematical knowledge did they just rise up in the desert out of the blue? Okay. Or are we dealing with something that was lost over time and maybe kept within these sects, within these little Jewish sects and so on? Maybe they had fragments of that knowledge, and that's what Gnosticism is. But if you believe that the pyramids are just built by slaves and they're just, no great deal, then there's no real evidence of anything to indicate that humanity was once more evolved than what it is now.
I sincerely hope that your first premise is correct, but I'd probably put a caveat on it. I think that, if anything, these messages have been put inside us, whether it be a genetic code or whatever, that something is in us that makes us want to be better than what we are.
There is that too. There's the subconscious thing that we want certain things, and then no matter how much you say you're a truth seeker, you are biased towards certain. You want something to be true, don't you?
Yes, you do. So hopefully we're progressing. I mean, if we were something better and we've lost it, that's really sad.
But then if you step back from this whole religious spiritual subject, if you just look at the world's, I mean, humanity is probably no different now than it ever was on many levels in terms of power. And you look at the way the world's money supply is hoarded, and the world's, if you look at the way politics works and all that, then you could argue, well, why wouldn't it work the same with advanced knowledge that could set people free? You could argue, well, maybe the Vatican. See, for example, what do you think's in the Vatican archives?
Roman uniforms, whatever. I can,
yeah,
I can see what you're getting at, but
yeah,
the great thing, James, no one has cheated death yet. Every person who has lived has died. Maybe when we see the Queen reach the age of 200, then I'll start believing, well, there's something really bad going on here.
Yeah.
But at the moment, everyone dies.
About the same age, don't they?
Yeah. So if there is this hidden thing, it's not helping people get immortality, but maybe that's going to be the next phase, which is the last chapter in the book, actually.
That's fascinating. And I mean, I like where I think what's going to be interesting is as you research this further, you've got to this point now. I'm really fascinated to see what your next books are going to be if you're writing more. And also, I know that you've moved into a screenplay as well. I haven't read it yet, but you've sent me this one called Gnosis, which is kind of interesting because it takes off from the last chapter in your latest book, A Crisis of Faith. And it seems to be, from what I've read so far on your screenplay, I've skimmed it, seems to be Gnosticism reimagined within 21st century technology. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, it's where, if we look at pure Gnosis, is man becomes God.
Right.
And for man to become God, he or she needs to be immortal. And what if we get to that? What if we get to a stage where a person through technology, whether it's uploading our consciousness or just simply living much longer lives, how that would affect the way that we live? If we do have this pure Gnosis, what happens to those people that can't do it? What happens to the normal people? Those people who aren't in the elite that can obtain this sort of immortality. That's what the screenplay is looking at.
Right. Well, that's going to be fascinating. I mean, you've explored so much in the ancient past, and then to go forward in the future with the same sort of ideas. I look forward to that, and I hope they can be made into a movie one day.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
Okay. Well, I think we should do this again sometime when you've written another book or two. And I'll. No pressure there.
No, I appreciate it, and mate, great work with the job you're doing with Lance on Underground Knowledge. It's an exceptional site that is very inclusive and is very fair in a topic area that can sort of go haywire. So,
oh, thanks, and I think some of the stuff we've discussed here fits in with that. That's why I had you on.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Okay, cheers, Tony, and we'll talk again soon.
Cheers, James.
Thanks, mate. Bye now.